Okay, so we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, which is about the tissues. And from the first page that we learned that there are 4 different types of tissues in the body. We've got epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So the first type of tissue we're going to be talking about is the epithelial tissue. Now, epithelial tissue has many different functions and different ways of recognizing it or classifying it from different tissues. The purpose or the function of epithelial tissues is the main one we're going to be talking about is it's going to be covering body surfaces. So number 2, it says that right there, covering body surfaces. Now this means that it's going to be acting like it's a protective barrier around things. So for the most prominent example I can think of is the skin. The skin is an example of epithelial tissue that's covering our entire bodies in order to protect it. Number 1 says that it's mostly composed of cells. Now what this is saying is that in some other types of tissues you might have like here's a cell and here's a cell, and they might be like spaced out, and then what they call the extracellular matrix is the stuff or the fluid outside the cell that the cells float in. Now with epithelial tissue they're saying it's mostly composed of cells, so that would mean that there's more densely packed together and that there's less extracellular fluid amongst them. Now for this, the next one says it has distinct cell surfaces. Now with these, I drew a little picture here. It says you'll have the basal surface of the cell, which is the side that is attached to the basement membrane. So this side of the cell is the basal surface because it's attached here. The free surface is the one that is exposed to the exterior. So this part is the top cell. Like if it were your skin, this would be the top layer. This is exposed to the air. And then the lateral surface is a surface that is connected to each other. So these two cells together, the lateral surface is the one in between. Something else is that here you have special cell connections. So in order for the cells to hold on to each other, they have certain different proteins and other things that are going to help link the cells together. Another thing about epithelial tissue is that they tend to be non-vascular, which means that there aren't blood vessels that actually extend into the cells themselves. So here I drew a picture of the basement membrane of the cells with the epitheliums here and the blood vessels that are actually underneath the skin and do not actually penetrate into the basement membrane or into the cells. So how the cells actually get their nutrients and their gases is that the nutrients and the gases have to diffuse across out of the blood vessels and diffuse across the membrane into the epitheliums. So let's turn the page. Another thing about epitheliums is that they are capable of regeneration. So these guys are going to undergo what's called meiosis or mitosis, and that's just going to involve the cell replicating and forming into multiple cells here. Some more functions of the epithelial tissues are, we mentioned it is a protective barrier. Another one is that it acts as a barrier. What the thing is here is that it, as like just like the plasma membrane in the cell, it's a selectively permeable, so it lets certain things come in and other stuff not come out. So like the skin, for example, acts as a barrier to reduce water loss from the body, so we don't lose a lot of water. Also permitting the passage of certain substances. So if we look at the epithelium or the cells of the lungs, we know that there's a give and take or flow of carbon dioxide and oxygen. So that's why it's permeable selectively to let certain things in and out. Another function or purpose of the epithelium is that it secretes substances. We know that if we look outside the body, we secrete things like saliva and sweat and tears and mucus, and those are also part of the epithelial cells. And lastly, we have absorbing. So there are certain cells in the body that are responsible for absorbing. You'll find these mostly in the digestive tract with the small intestines. When digesting your food, it's going to be absorbing those vitamins and minerals. Now, when we look at the classification of epithelial tissues, we can look at them, what their shape is to determine what we're going to call them. So I'm going to draw a picture. Here we have epitheliums are either going to be shaped like this, or like this. This one looks like a little squashed pancake, and these are actually called squamous. So the flat, squished appearance is a squamous type of epithelium. This one is shaped like a square or a cube, and so this one's going to be called cuboidal, and this last one is shaped just like a column, and this one's going to be called columnar. Now, you'll find that epithelium can be any one of these shapes. So that's why we're talking about all three, because you're going to find different ones in different places in the body. So now, other than just its shape, they have different arrangements that the cells can be in. So you're either going to have one layer or multiple layers. If you were to have one layer of the squamous, you'd be calling this simple squamous epithelium, because simple means one layer. Now, if I were to add more layers to it, then now it is no longer simple, so we can erase that, and now we can call it stratified. So this would be an example of stratified squamous. And you can do the same thing with all three different shapes. So this would be an example of simple, because it's one layer, cuboidal. And keep going, we have, this would be simple columnar. Now if I were to add a second layer to this, adding another layer, it would be stratified cuboidal. If I were to add a second layer to these, this would be stratified columnar epithelium. Now there are a couple exceptions to this rule here. There's one that we call pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now, we know that stratified means multiple layers, and columnar is referring to this shape. So you would expect to see something that looks like this. You'd expect to see multiple layers of columnar epithelium. But in the case here, it says pseudostratified. Now, the word pseudo actually means false. So it's going to actually look like it's stratified, but not actually be. So I kind of drew a picture here. Where the columnars are all different lengths. So this is a longer one, this is maybe a shorter one, longer, longer, shorter, shorter. So it kind of looks like, they're different layers because they're different heights. But in actuality, there's not a second layer on top of them. It's just each one of these only has one. So pseudostratified is going to look stratified, but it's still going to be just one layer. And the last one that you should know about is called the transitional epithelium. Now these are pretty cool. I like these. So let me draw a picture of what that's going to be like. Transitional epithelium are typically going to be found, well, the example I'm going to use is the bladder, because that's the example that the book uses. So if we pretend this is our bladder, and this would be like the ureters and the kidney, but that's not important. The wall of the bladder is going to be made up of cuboidal. So it's going to be squares all the way around. Now, when the bladder is empty, there's no pressure in the bladder from water pressing up against the cells. So it's going to be kind of deflated, like kind of like a water balloon. But if you start adding water into the bladder water doesn't actually come in that way. It would come from the ureters. So if you add water to the bladder and it starts filling up, it's going to expand and stretch just like a water balloon would. So these cuboidal cells are going to be stretched out, and pressure is going to be placed against them, and it's going to expand the bladder. So now the bladder is actually going to be squamous because it's going to flatten out to allow stretching and make room for more fluids inside the bladder. So this is an example of transitional, which means to change, so that they would switch from being cuboidal epitheliums to squamous formation. The only other thing you should know about epitheliums is the protein called keratin, or if something is keratinized or non-keratinized. Essentially, you have, let's say this is a cell and this is a cell. Now, they're going to be pretty much the same in function and in shape and everything else, except for one main difference. One difference here is that you can have a protein called keratin cover the cell, and this one's not going to have it. So this one's going to be non-keratinized, and this one is going to be keratinized. The purpose of keratin is that keratin's actually a protein, and it's going to be covering the cell surface to prevent water from entering into the cell. So it's kind of, if you think of it as a raincoat, covering the cell to keep it dry,
this keratin makes the cell water resistant. So you're going to find keratin. You're going to find keratin on epitheliums that are actually dry to the touch. So like your skin on your arms, your legs, your face, all that, those are all dry. But if you notice inside your mouth, it's moist, along with your eyes and other moist places of the body like your throat. They are going to be non-keratinized because they are moist. They don't have this protective coating, not protective necessarily, but water-resistant coating, so that it actually allows those cells to be moist. So for like a test question, they might ask you like where you'll find keratinized cells, and that would be like on the skin, and you'd find non-keratinized cells in the eyes and inside the mouth.